Hey y'all, it's entry number 35 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on David Montgomery, running back, Chicago Bears. We'll start with the positives with David Montgomery's fantasy profile. Dual threat. Over the past couple of seasons, David Montgomery has proven himself to be a solid dual threat option, carrying the ball at least 225 times and catching at least 25 passes in each of his first 3 seasons in the league, according to Pro Football Reference. By being capable both on the ground and through the air, it gives Montgomery more opportunities to stay on the field and score fantasy points. The next major positive with David Montgomery's fantasy profile is his previous opportunity and snap share numbers. During the 2021 season, David Montgomery saw a snap share of 74.8%, the second best among running backs, and an opportunity share of 80%, the fourth best among running backs. During the 2020 season, these numbers were also very high, with a snap share of 72.9%, the third best among running backs, and an opportunity share of 90%, the best among running backs according to Player Profiler. Not many backs have shown that they can get this kind of workload, and this volume makes it easier for Montgomery to be consistent on a week-to-week basis in your fantasy leagues. The third major positive with David Montgomery's fantasy profile is his red zone usage. David Montgomery had 50 total red zone touches in 2021, the fifth most among running backs, and 54 total red zone touches in 2020, the sixth most among running backs according to Player Profiler. By frequently getting touches in the red zone, it raises the possibility for more scoring opportunities from Montgomery, and therefore fantasy points. Moving on to some of the concerns with David Montgomery's fantasy profile. To start, we gotta talk about how he had the lowest yards per carry among the Bears running backs in 2021. During the 2021 NFL season, David Montgomery carried the ball 225 times for 849 rushing yards and 7 rushing touchdowns. Meanwhile, backup running backs Khalil Herbert and Damian Williams were quite a bit more efficient. Herbert carried the ball 103 times for 433 rushing yards and had a clip of 4.2 yards per carry, while Damian Williams carried the ball 40 times for 164 rushing yards at a clip of 4.1 yards per carry. While this certainly can be partially attributed to David Montgomery dealing with injuries and the different offensive line combinations the Bears had last year, this is still not something that you like to see, and raises some minor concerns about Montgomery seeing the ridiculous workload shares that he's seen in the past. The next major concern I have with Montgomery's fantasy profile is his offensive line. During the 2021 season, the Bears' offensive line ranked 22nd according to Pro Football Focus. While the line should be a little different as they only bring back 3 of their 5 starters from 2021, they are still projected to be below average as Pro Football Focus ranks them as the 31st best offensive line in the league going into 2022. By having a below average offensive line, it makes David Montgomery's job more difficult and likely leads him to being more inefficient. The last major concern I have with David Montgomery's fantasy profile is his team's offense. Last year, the Bears were 24th in the league in yards per game with 307.4 and 27th in points per game with 18.3 according to ESPN. While there is a shot at improvement in 2022 with the play calling change and Justin Fields getting more comfortable in the offense in general during his second year in the league, there's still a pretty strong chance that this offense is once again in the bottom half of the league this year. Some additional thoughts on David Montgomery. During the 2021 NFL season, Montgomery finished as the RB20 in standard with 154.0 total fantasy points and 11 fantasy points per game. The RB21 in half PPR formats with 175.0 total fantasy points and 12.5 fantasy points per game, and the RB20 in full PPR formats with 196.0 total fantasy points and 14.0 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 NFL season, in half PPR formats, David Montgomery had 0 out of 13 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 7 out of 13 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 13 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 13 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 3 out of 13 games with 20 to 30 fantasy points, according to fantasy data. During the 2020 NFL season, David Montgomery finished as the RB6 in standard with 210.8 total fantasy points and 14.1 fantasy points per game, the RB4 in half PPR formats with 237.8 total fantasy points and 15.9 fantasy points per game, and the RB4 in full PPR formats with 264.8 total fantasy points and 17.7 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2020 season, in half PPR formats, David Montgomery had 1 out of 15 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 2 out of 15 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 15 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 4 out of 15 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 15 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points, according to fantasy data. Play calling change. The Chicago Bears will be going from Matt Nagy or Bill Lazor calling the plays on offense to new offensive coordinator Luke Getsy calling the plays. During his first couple of years calling the plays at the college level, Getsy had some run-heavy offenses, which is encouraging. The big question mark, though, is will he provide the same bell cow workload that Nagy and Lazor have provided Montgomery the last couple of years, or will he shift it to a more running back by committee approach in 2022? David Montgomery had a knee hyperextension sprain last year that caused him to miss 4 games and may have impacted his play in a few games that he was active for. Personal opinion. David Montgomery is currently going off the board as RB17, about pick 34 overall on ESPN, and RB18, about pick 33 overall on Yahoo. His profile is a mixed bag. On the bright side, he's been very consistent in his production on a week-to-week basis over the past 2 seasons, with just 1 game in his last 28 where he scored less than 5 fantasy points. He's finished as a top 6 fantasy back in the past, and he should be healthier than last year going into the 2022 season. But there are also some concerns with the offensive line and the team's offense in general. I think that the X factor here is going to be offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. I think he will give the team's running back room more work in general than Matt Nagy did, but I also think that we will see less of a bell cow approach than the high opportunity shares that Nagy and Lazor provided Montgomery in the past. If I had to guess, I think he's likely going to be a solid RB2 again, and while he's not the flashiest pick, he's a decent fallback option in this draft range if your favorite draft targets get sniped. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. David Montgomery has shouted out Gen Youth in the past on his Twitter. Gen Youth is a nationally recognized youth wellness organization that helps create healthy school communities by empowering students and providing the resources for youth to build healthy, high-achieving futures. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.